It's the Walter Ostlie question and answer show. You ask them, I answer them. Walter Ostlie question and answer. Hey, Walter here, doing what I can to make comics easier, demystifying the process because it shouldn't be overwhelming or daunting to tell your story. I make videos about making comics and everything to do with comics, so make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any videos. And today we have question and answer time, so let's go ahead and get started with our first question. Aisha Khan asks, background tips for beginners. Now Aisha, I'm sorry, this question should have been in the last set of videos, but I scrolled past the question because there were so many questions. I put more space between the questions this time, so hopefully I won't miss any. But background tips for beginners, my first tip is just to keep it simple. Don't worry about drawing like overly detailed, complex backgrounds. The simpler you keep your background, actually the more you're going to engage your reader, because they're going to have to use their imagination to picture what that looks like. So it's actually a good way to get your readers more engaged with your story. So I'd say keep it simple. Now, if you're asking about practicing backgrounds, then just like go on Google, do searches for, buildings or mountains or forest, and then draw from that. Or even better, just go outside, depending on where you live, and just draw what's around you, your house, your background, draw a tree. And that's a really good way to practice drawing backgrounds. But if you're talking specifically for drawing backgrounds in comics and you're not used to drawing backgrounds, just keep it simple. Think about the iconic shapes, like a house is basically a box with a triangle on top of it. Mountains are just triangles, trees are just cylinders. Just keep it simple. It's in the background. The reader will do all of the work for you. Gingy Kid asks, what is the workload of a Webtoons featured creator? And what do they ask of you? So the workload is pretty intense for a featured creator. You need to have a new episode every week, and those episodes have to be 40 to 50. Some of those comics go up to 100 episodes, but I believe their requirements are sitting around like 50 episodes every week. And so if you think about that in traditional comic terms, that could be like 8 to 12 pages of traditional comics every week. That is a lot, and they have to be written, drawn, colored, and letter. And if you're just one person, just imagine the amount of work that takes. It has to be a full-time job unless you're really fast, or if you're working with multiple people, then you can probably get it done within a week while you're doing something else. But it is a lot, so you need to do an episode every week. Granted, yes, before they ever start posting, you could build up your buffer. I mean, technically, if you wanted to, you could finish your entire Webtoon arc, story, chapter, whatever you want to call it, before it ever starts posting, so you wouldn't have to worry about that. But in general, most of those creators, and when I was doing it, I did it on a week-by-week basis. So you have to do all of that work within a week. So it is a lot of work. Think about how long it would take you to draw those 50 panels, and then figure out, like, is it possible for you to do it within a week? Like, how much would you have to kill yourself? How much would you have to have done beforehand so that your buffer is kind of being whittled down as you're slowly working on the other episodes until you got to your last episode for that season? Would the buffer catch up with you? So you got to kind of figure that out. But yeah, the workload is pretty intense. Diana Fadal asks, I'm interested in hearing about how long it typically takes for each step of the process in terms of what it takes to get one chapter done a week. Unordinary seems to have 70 panels per chapter, Castle Swimmer about 50, Hardcore Leveling Warrior like 90 panels. Curious how many hours it takes for you to do one chapter. Now this is similar to the next question from Candy, which is, how long do you think a 30-panel episode should take for 3 people working on it? Now this is a really tough question to answer. I mean, technically the answer is it should take you a week, because you have to post a new episode every week when you're doing an original comic. Now how long this is going to take particular people, it's really tough to say. So for me, when I was doing Hacksaw, I was doing about an episode and a half every week. But with Hacksaw, I had a colorist helping me out, so that made the process a lot quicker. Now, when I am working on my comics, most of my time is spent drawing the comics, like actually doing the pence inkling or the inking and drawing. I spend about a day thumbnailing the entire episode. I like to give myself a day to thumbnail that particular episode, and I like to do all of my work in chunks, right? So I consider a chunk an episode. So I do all of the work for an episode before I move on to the next episode, which means I thumbnail it, draw it, color it, and letter it, and then I move on to the next one. There was a time when I would like draw about 5 episodes or 10 episodes and then go back and then color them and then go back and then letter them. But it took so long to draw the 5 or the 10 episodes, and then so when I went back to color it, I kind of forgot how to color, and then I would have to color 10 episodes. And then by the time I went back to draw, I forgot how to draw. So I'd have to relearn that. So it was a lot of stopping and starting. And I found when I just did an episode drawing, episode coloring, that made it easier to remember how to draw, remember how to color, remember how to letter. So I would definitely say figure out like what that length of time is for yourself and do it that way. Now, if you are working on a week-to-week basis and you're like on that deadline each time, you're not gonna have a choice. You're gonna have to work episode by episode. Unless, of course, like Candy says, you're working with 3 people. Now that's gonna speed things up. And I can't say how long that stuff takes. I did the video series where I did start to finish Webtoon. Now granted, that was a 15 panel comic, but I added up all the time that it took, and I want to say it was like 4 or 6 hours to do the writing, the thumbnailing, the drawing, the coloring, and the lettering, and all of the uploading. So 4 to 6 hours doesn't seem like a long time, but if, let's say it's 5 because the math is easier, that's 15 panels, you got to triple that, right? So that would be 15 hours. So if you have 15 hours in your week, and that comic was actually really easy, so you kind of have to figure that out. So figure anywhere from like 20 to 30 hours, possibly 40 hours depending on your art style. My art style is pretty simple. If you have a really detailed art style, it's going to take you longer to draw. I mean, that's for me to draw a circle smiley face and for someone to draw a realistic portrait, those are 2 huge different amounts of time is required. I mean, just to draw the smiley face, I'm going to be quicker no matter what, because I have to do 2 lines and then 2 dots and I'm done. If you're doing a realistic face, you're going to be, how many lines do you have? I don't even know. Too many. So it's going to take you longer to work. And so that's why I say it's hard to really nail down how long it should take. And the easiest answer is it's got to take less than a week, because you have to have it done for next week to have it posted, and you don't want to miss your deadlines. And now this is for original comics, and it's usually week by week. If you have a simpler comic, you might be posting it every day, like for a slice of life, gag strip, comedy strip. So everything depends, right? So you got to figure out what works for you, and this is a ton of work. It does take a lot of time. So if you're not an original Canvas creator who has the opportunity to do it full-time, or at least most of your time, and you're doing it as a Canvas, you might not want to put that amount of workload on yourself. And like I've said in previous videos, just figure out what your schedule looks like, how much time you have, and what you can realistically do on a reoccurring basis for your comics. So I don't know if that helped. There was a question about all of the comics having different panel counts. And that's a thing, right? Some people work faster than others. Some people might have stories that need more panels, or they have a slower pace, and the slower your pace of your comic is, it's usually more panels, because the more panels you have tend to slow things down. And so if you're trying to have a very moody comic, you're most likely gonna have more panels. Now, usually those panels might be simpler panels, not always true, but you could have repeating panels, or like empty panels, or very sparse panels, and that kind of helps to slow things down and make it more moody, versus like an action comic, you kind of just want it slamming and jamming. One panel to the next panel are like huge jumps in time. There's a lot of stuff happening in the gutter that we don't see. So it depends. I wish I had a better answer to that question. It's going to take as much time as you need it to take. There is no oh, you did that too fast, or oh no, you spent too long doing it, other than if you miss your deadline, of course. So figure out what it is for you, how fast you can do it, and then, obviously give yourself a little bit of a break in there, because you're not a machine. None of us are machines, and we need time to relax. So hopefully that was able to at least give you some insight or answer your questions. If it doesn't, then I don't know. maybe if I think about it more, like eventually I'll have like a really good answer for people and I'll do a video about it. But let's go to the next question. Caravan's Art asks, tips on finishing your panels faster. How do you sketch up backgrounds or get objects to begin with? How do you promote your Webtoon? That's a lot of questions, so let's start with tips on your panels faster. So basically, tips to get it done faster are to keep it simple. If you did a lot of work beforehand, like a lot of character sketches, a lot of expression sketches for your characters, like drawing the character's clothes, that gives you something to refer back to, so you're not always guessing, like what does this character look like when they're screaming or smiling or has a sly look on their face. You can look back at all your character designs and you'll have that, so you can just draw from that and be done, as opposed to like trying to like sketch it out every time and not quite getting the character's look. So stuff like that will help, keeping your background simple, keeping your coloring style simple. You have to realize that you're doing these comics on a weekly basis. You can't have these super highly overly detailed panels and keep that consistent for, the 50 panels for that episode, and then for 50 episodes across that entire season, and then season after season. I'm sure there's people out there, I couldn't do it. So you got to keep things simple. You got to realize what you're working with, and yeah, you want to keep your art style and all that stuff cool, but you got to keep it within reason, what works for that format. Also remember, a lot of people are reading on their phones, so if you have these like crazy detailed images, people aren't going to be able to notice as much on their phone. And the second part of that, like how do you sketch up the backgrounds? There's a lot of backgrounds out there. If you're using Clip Studio, I think they have a lot of environments and stuff that you can pull in. You can look on Google Images, just search for New York City or New York slums or the mountains or the forest or fantasy forest or the water or the ocean or coral reefs. Whatever it is, like Google search it's gonna be out there for you. And sometimes you gotta get clever with what you're typing to get exactly what you're looking for. Like you could, instead of just saying New York, like you might have to be like the alleyway of, the New York building if you kind of want to get that street view. The other cool thing you can do is go to Google Maps and then go to the street view, and you can like basically maneuver around the streets of New York until you find the cool angle that you want. So that's an option there, and those are good ways to also to get reference for practicing, like I think I mentioned earlier. The next part of that question is, how do you promote your Webtoon? Which Risa Ann also asked, how do you get your comic noticed? Now this is really hard. Everyone struggles with this, and it's not just comics, musicians, writers, even companies have to work really hard to get their product noticed. And the only way you really have is just to keep grinding, to keep sharing, to keep telling people about it, posting on Instagram, Twitter, who use TikTok to talk about your comics or your artwork. You basically have to keep pushing, and keep pushing. You can't just put your comic on Webtoon and hope something happens. Most likely that's not gonna work. There's so much out there. To expect like 100 people or 500 or 1,000 or 40,000 people to accidentally find your comic is just not realistic. You have to push it into people's faces a bunch of times before they break down and go like, okay, I guess I'll check out your comic. So it is a struggle. It can be very tiring. It can take an emotional toll, but that's just kind of something that all creators have to deal with. And eventually the good news is once you start building that up, it gets a little bit easier to keep building up to get to a higher amount of readers, and the more readers you get, the more it can go up. So that's the bright side to the thing. It's really slow at the beginning, and even as you get further in, it's going to feel slow because now that you have 50,000 people subscribed to your comic, you might get another 2,000. But that 2,000 compared to that 50,000 doesn't seem as big, versus like if you only had one subscriber and then you got 2,000 subscribers, it's like a huge jump. So it's something to keep in mind, like realize where you are and kind of celebrate the little celebrations Celebrate the celebration, celebrate all your celebrations. But no, realize where you are and, be happy, celebrate your little victories that you get, and try to keep all of that in perspective. Some things that you can do, like I said, Instagram, TikTok, Snip, Snap, Shappity Shap, Reddits, go to Reddits. And when you go to these places, you can't just like show up and be like, yo, check out my comic, and then dip out. That's not how it works. Anybody can do that, and everybody has done that. And it's like, why should I care? Like, why do I care that you have a comic? Let me know who you are. Let me know what you're all about. Let us become friends. And then you tell me about your comic, and I'm like, oh, you know what? Like, that person's pretty cool. They have a comic. Their comic is probably pretty cool. And yes, it does take time. You gotta go to these communities and become part of these communities. And that also is a big thing too, is you want to support other people. You can't just expect people to support you, do absolutely nothing. You have to put the work in. You support other creators, talk to other creators, become friends with other creators, help them, let them help you, ask for their help, ask them if they need help. You need to become part of this community. Comics is a pretty small world. As you start meeting people, you realize these people know those people, and it's this whole big supportive community for the most part. At least when I started working on comics, like, people are super eager to help. They want other people to make comics. They want more comics in the world. They want more people reading comics. And that's basically like why I do this YouTube channel, because I know I struggled a lot when I was first starting out, and I didn't know how to do certain things. And I was always questioning, whether I was doing something right or if I was doing something good, worthwhile. So that's why I do this YouTube channel. To give back, right? I'm trying to help other people. When I do this, I'm also kind of helping myself. Other people are helping me when they ask their questions or tell me new stuff, because it's forcing me to actually think about what I'm doing. So I'm growing from that, and hopefully helping to grow other people. But it's kind of a give and take, like if I just showed up and was like, hey, support my Kickstarter, you'd be like, whatever, but like, because there's this community now, we're all more likely to help support each other. And so that's the way to get your comic noticed. It is a lot of work. You can't expect it to be simple. So yeah, you got to put the work in. You got to help other people. You got to help other comics. And in return, that will help you back. So it's kind of like this symbiotic relationship. You can't be parasitic about it. So yeah, go help other people, and in return, that will come back on you, hopefully in a good way. Sweet Dolce, or Dulce, or Dolce, Sweet Goodness asks, how do you add music in the background of a webtoon? Haven't been able to figure it out. Unfortunately, unless you're an original featured comic, you cannot upload music. I also believe you cannot upload animated images either. It's just something that the featured webtoon original creators can do. Also, with the banner image, that's something that only original comics have access to. Potato Girl Plob Plob asks, is it okay to draw all panels separately first and then put all the panels in a long panel white background for a comic? Yes, that is totally acceptable. Create, however many 800 by 1280 pixels you need, and then you don't even have to put them together if you don't want to. You could take all those files and upload them straight into Webtoon and be done. But you could also draw like a bunch of, make a 800 by 500 file, draw your panel in there, and create a whole bunch of those. Do an 800 by 15,000, draw your panel in there, and then you could bring all of those into a really tall file. To make sure all the spacing is correct, move everything around, letter it, and then you could go to Croppy, which I've talked about in other videos, but it's basically a website where you can upload really long files and it chops it up for Webtoon specifically. So yeah, that's a perfectly valid way to do it. You don't have to do the way I do it or how other people do it, whatever works best for you. And I know a lot of people are drawing on their phones, which is crazy to me. I can't even imagine, so that's pretty awesome. But if you're working on a phone, it's going to be really hard to do it the way that I do it. So doing single files is probably the easiest way for phone. So yeah, perfectly valid way to do it. Don't feel like you have to do it whichever way, right? If you have a way where you can draw a comic and it makes something that's readable to people and you can get that up to Webtoon, boom, you did it the right way. We got another one from Sweet Dolce, Sweet Goodness, and they ask, what are the biggest challenges of being an author on Webtoon? There's a whole bunch of questions, so let's start with that because I always forget what the next question is. So what are the biggest challenges of being? So the biggest challenge, of course, is just the workload and the time frame that you're working in. You have to create a really solid, good story with a really fierce deadline. So that's one of the toughest things out there. Some people would say that maybe putting your comic out into the world and, you know, having your comic being judged could also be stressful for a lot of people. Now, I've noticed when I've put my comics out there, I've done both a featured comic and my own canvas comics, and I would say for the most part the audience is really positive. They're all excited about reading new comics. I think most of the people who seem to be negative about it usually aren't being supported by your particular or the bigger reading audience, so they tend not to hang around. It doesn't seem, you know, knock on wood, I'm probably cursing myself, it doesn't seem like there are a lot of trolls, and if there are, I think the more positive community kind of forces them out or just completely ignores them, which, by the way, is the best thing to do with trolls, is to maybe not ignore them, but be like, oh, you know, thanks for reading, you know, and there's nothing for them to work with there. And then after that, you kind of just ignore them. So that might be a thing, but I've noticed that the Webtoon community in general is really positive. They do offer constructive feedback about certain things, which I thought was awesome. It made me think about things that I hadn't thought about before. So that's actually pretty good. So I would say the workload is the hardest thing. If you want to make comics, you have to share them anyway. So I don't think that's any different with Webtoon. There is a large audience on Webtoon, so that can be kind of daunting, but I would say not worry about it. You know, figure out your schedule, what your schedule works for you so that it's not overwhelming, and the audience there is pretty helpful. So I think those are probably the hardest things about working with Webtoon, at least that I can come up with right now. All right, the second question is, what are some good things to practice on to improve a good Webtoon? Speed. The faster you can draw, the better off you're going to be. Obviously, because of the timeline, so the faster you can do it, faster you can draw, the more time you can spend on other things like promoting your comic. So the more time you can get with just your comic in general would be a good thing, and that would help increase the readership of your comic, and you know, you can focus on other stuff as well to build up your webcomic. Other than that, you know, storytelling, but you're going to be practicing that as you're writing your story, as you're drawing your story. You're going to be constantly, it's like on the job training, right? Like you're writing your story, you're drawing your story, so you kind of have that built-in practice. You don't actually have to practice anything because you're doing it and you're practicing it at the same time. But if I had to say something, I would say speed, becoming comfortable with your art style to where you're not second guessing yourself. This was a big thing for me when I was first starting out. I had so much self-doubt about, you know, whether I was good enough, and I still have that self-doubt, but I kind of come around to this realization that, you know, I am what I am, and I draw like I draw, and if some people don't like that, that's fine. You know, not everyone's gonna like how you draw, and some people like it, that's awesome too. But that's just how I draw. That's how I want to draw. That's what I think looks cool. It's not always perfect, that's fine, you know. But yeah, becoming comfortable with yourself, with your art style, with how you draw is going to help speed things up, because instead of second guessing like, oh, you know, is that how you're supposed to draw a hand? Like, who cares? Like, that's how you drew the hand. And unless it's like completely like wonky, or you put the left hand on the right arm and that wasn't your intention, or you forgot to draw the thumb, you know, you might want to add the thumb. I don't know. Does it matter? Is anyone looking for thumbs? I don't read comics and specifically look at the panels and go, okay, did that person draw the thumb and was the hand on the right arm? I don't look at that stuff. I look at the words. I might look at the expressions. Like sometimes if it's a cool action panel and they're doing something, some kung fu or something, like I'll look at that and be like, oh, that's cool. But yeah, you know, I'm not looking at hands. I'm not judging hand drawings. If there's an artist I like a lot and I think they draw really well and they've figured out really intelligent ways to draw things and simplify things, then I'll go back and I'll study those things. But when I'm just reading the comic, like I'm not trying to judge the comic. And that's a little hard when you're an artist and a writer. It's like, it's kind of hard to turn off that aspect of your brain and kind of just enjoy it for what it is. But most people are reading it just to read your comic. And so they're not looking at stuff like that. So I'm not sure what my point was. What's good to practice? Speed, becoming comfortable, and basically stop worrying about stuff. Just draw it, write your story, do your thing. I think there was another part to this question. Why did you decide to start your Webtoon series, and who inspired you? So my Webtoon, I became featured, so that was a big reason to do that series. But just in general, for making comics, the reason I started making comics is because I had ideas. I watched other movies, I read other books, I read other comics, and I was like, man, like, can I find a story that is this thing? And I couldn't find that. You know, there was stuff that was close to that, but not exactly that. And I'm like, you know what? Like, I'm gonna write it myself. I'm gonna create it myself because it doesn't exist right now, and it's something that I really want. It's something that I want to enjoy, and so that's the reason I started writing. And I went from writing into drawing. I started off as a writer. Yeah, that's the whole reason I started, was to bring something, to read something, to enjoy something that didn't exist yet, at least not in the exact way that I wanted it to. So that's why I started. That was my inspiration. A lot of my stories were based just on things that I liked. Like Shiver Bureau is basically Sherlock Holmes and the Ghostbusters smashed together because I love mysteries and I love supernatural stuff. So that was Shiver Bureau. The other book I did, Cubicles, was basically kind of a slice of life, but in space story, because I used to work in an office, work in a cubicle. So I thought that would be something funny and kind of close to life that I could work on. Hacksaw was a reason to basically have the freedom to draw whatever I want, because it took place in virtual reality. So actually I didn't have any rules, because, you know, a lot of times when people are creating stuff, like they're doing all of their world building and there's all these rules. Hacksaw was basically me being like, screw that. Like, I get to do whatever I want because it's not real. And so if things aren't real, there are no rules. And yeah, there were still some rules, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, it was basically a way for me to be like, I get to do whatever I want. So yeah, so that's where that came from. And then the new story that I'm working on, which hopefully you guys will see sooner than later, is also in that. Like, it's basically like, I want something that feels like a Saturday morning cartoon that's just kind of silly and over the top. And yeah, so that's where that stuff comes from. A lot of the inspiration for stories also came from just doodling characters, and I'm like, you know, this character looks kind of cool. What would their story be? And that kind of tied back into, like, you know, the whole, like, what stuff do I like? So it all kind of works together. It's just about immersing yourself into things, but then also stepping back away from entertainment. Like, you don't want to just constantly consume other people's stuff without stepping back, pushing that stuff to the side, and just kind of being alone with your thoughts and thinking about, like, you know, what's going to entertain me? What's something that I'm surrounded by nothing, right? I'm ignoring everything. What thoughts jump into my brain to keep myself entertained when nothing else is going on? So that's kind of where all that comes from. I'm not sure if that answered the questions, but it's basically bringing stories, bringing characters, bringing worlds that didn't exist exactly the way I wanted them to, and then bringing them into existence so that I could enjoy them, and hopefully other people would enjoy them because they weren't there before. So this particular video I recorded was probably like an hour and a half worth of questions, and I was wondering, like, at the end of the recording, my butt kind of hurt because I had been sitting in the chair for so long. I'm not gonna post an hour and a half video. I'm gonna break this up into chunks, like maybe 30-minute chunks or something like that, and post it. If you want to help me keep making comics easier, make sure to like, link, love, hug, and hit that sub button for more sweet, sweet goodness. Peace.